each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert.
Konnichiwa, or good afternoon, bikes. My name's Jazjeet and I'm the president of the Japanese Club. We're here today to talk about Executive Order 9066, which allowed for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the Day of Remembrance, a day of observance for the incarceration of Japanese Americans. February 19th of this year, 2022, was actually the 80th anniversary of Day of Remembrance. We will now walk you through the events that happened before, during, and after the passing of Executive Order 9066, and not to forget why this topic still needs to be discussed presently.
In the 1870s, many Japanese people immigrated to America to chase their American dream. These immigrants worked as laborers on farms, mines, railroads, factories, and fishing boats. Even though many of these farmers were given barren plots of land, through hard work, these farmers were able to transform these plots of land into lush farms. Through this, these farmers were able to gain the respect of many, and for a short period of time, they were able to assimilate into the American society.
Around 90,000 children have been going to get education from American schools, living around California, Washington, and New Mexico. Some had faced general racism during their school lives and bullied to some extent. Strictly education-wise, Japanese Americans were learning and studying just like any other student. However, the Immigration Act of 1924 had forced all Japanese Americans to squeeze into limited classrooms with even fewer teachers to teach them.
The Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 was an agreement between Japan and America in which Japan agreed not to issue passports to citizens seeking to go to the U.S., with the exception of classified business and professional men. Despite Theodore Roosevelt's efforts to desegregate San Franciscan schools, the growing anti-Japanese sentiment continued only to increase, as California feared the Japanese would steal most of the good farmland and depress wages. This act was followed by the Immigration Act of 1924.
In early 1932, as tension grew between the United States and Japan, the State Department and U.S. Navy became increasingly involved in national security. They wanted to investigate potential espionage on the West Coast, which could have allegedly resulted in U.S. sabotage. Japanese citizens of high interest were classified into three groups. Group A classified suspects were seen as dangerous and considered leaders of sabotage. This group included fishermen, produce distributors, Shinto and Buddhist priests, farmers, influential businessmen, and members of the Japanese consulate. Group B suspects were seen as potentially dangerous, but were not fully investigated, and Group C suspects were under the suspicion of sabotage due to their pro-Japanese beliefs. Japanese language teachers, kibeis, martial art instructors, community servants, travel agents, social directors, and newspaper editors were among the suspects with B or C categories. Immediately after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, all Japanese who had been classified into A, B, and C categories were taken into custody. After the next 2 days, 1,291 Japanese Americans were detained.
On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 with the stated intention of preventing espionage on American shores.
Before Executive Order 9066 was passed, there were 127,000 Japanese Americans living in America.
The order created an exclusion zone for citizens of Japanese ancestry, and approximately 112,000 men, women, and children were forcibly displaced from their homes, only being able to bring what they could carry.
If this happened to you today, how would you feel, and what would you do to prepare for it?
It'd be like a caged bird, I guess, where you would try to speak out, but you can't. You can't say anything. You're forced to do this.
I'd feel like a lot of dread and really trying to figure out everything as quickly as possible, like where to put my dog and what to do with their house, and medication wise for my grandma, what to do with her.
I would feel so much just hopelessness and just frightened that why is this happening to me, and just there's nothing you can really do about it, and you're not sure what's going to happen when you get to the camp, and just you don't know that much about it, or when you're even going to be let out of the camp.
I would personally feel very dejected. I would feel very frustrated. I can't really do anything about my current situation. I would have to leave, everything I grew up with, everyone I know, and then I would have to move to a completely unknown area. I would have to try to adapt in this situation where I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, even if I'm going to be safe tomorrow.
Okay, if you brought 7 things and you could only bring 7 things when you were interned, what would you bring?
I would bring cleaning supplies like toothbrushes and brushes to clean the toilets. Definitely some toilet paper so I can clean myself after the people that use the toilet. Some extra clothes, extra socks in case it gets rainy. Definitely my hoodies and coats so I can keep warm. Some masks for myself because it would be extremely contagious in there. And toothbrushes and anything that helps promote healthy hygiene. And definitely some entertainment for my family and pictures of my mom and dad.
I would bring my smartphone, my Attack on Titan collection, and my PC.
Well, I would bring, also my PC, and I would bring toilet paper and maybe maybe some clothes.
That's 3 items.
A guitar, probably acoustic since I wouldn't have an amp. Can I bring a piano? That'd be really cool too. Probably bring a reusable or refillable water bottle, like a hydro flask. Probably didn't have that in the 1940s.
The Japanese were held in various relocation camps and other confinement sites across the country for the next few years.
Since there was no insulation or privacy, incarcerees stuffed cracks with newspaper and rags and strung up sheets to keep the harsh weather out. Noise traveled easily within the barracks because the partitions did not touch the ceiling.
While interned, the Japanese lived in poor conditions all throughout the year. Divided into 4 or 6 rooms, each barrack was divided with each room that can hold 1 family. There was no running water, and the thin walls offered little protection from the harsh weather, which ranged from 110 degrees in the summer to 25 degrees below zero on winter nights.
The perimeter of the camps was tightly guarded with soldiers and barbed wire. They were told it was for their own protection, but the guns were pointed inside.
In a quote from Norman Mineta, an ex-intern from Heart Mountain, Wyoming, who is also the Commerce Secretary for Bill Clinton, said that,
"We have no furniture," Mineta recalls. "All you get is 4 blank walls and 1 light bulb in the middle of the room and a black pot bellied stove over in the corner and cots. That was it. They had created their own furniture out of any material they could use like metals, scraps, and wood."
As entertainment, the Japanese played sports that related to their own culture. It ranged from sumo, judo, and created places like baseball in large fields to keep themselves from being bored and create a happy relationship with their neighbors or families. They had also turned scrap wood into small painted birds for young children who could not play with the older kids. Children made up half of the incarcerated population.
After the end of the war, Japanese Americans were, in theory, allowed to return to their lives. They were given a bus ticket to anywhere and only $25, $400 in today's money. Usually their homes were taken, sold, or no longer there. A study found that, quote, internment in a camp greatly reduces the distance between an individual's ultimate residence and their camp assignment, with people living roughly 10 to 20% closer to their last assigned camp. The poorest regions fare worse later in life relative to their peers who are assigned to wealthier regions of the country by many different metrics. Those who were suspected of not being loyal, or who had said they would not be willing to fight for the U.S. Army, or announced their allegiance to Japan were shunned by Americans even after the war. The U.S. slowly came to grips with the wrongful imprisonment of innocent Americans, taking decades for reparations and even an apology from the government.
Now we have Ms. Branch here, who is the speech pathologist here at Curtis and our co-advisor for the Japanese Club. We'll be asking her a couple questions about her heritage, and could you please just tell us a little bit about your grandparents' and great-grandparents' story?
Yeah, so I guess I'll kind of start from the beginning.
Yeah.
My family came over in the early 1900s, and then they were farmers, and eventually my grandma's side, I call her my nana, her family owned an apartment building. And then my grandpa's side, they were also farmers, I think, maybe. Maybe they owned a store. I don't know much about that side, but they were both Japanese. Both came here around the same time, and then were both interned.
What about after the war had ended and the camps were closed down?
So that's something that I'm very grateful for, is what happened. Both sides of my family, I think this is pretty rare, both sides of my family experienced huge acts of kindness. And my Nana's side, her family came back to their apartment building, and this is how the legend goes. So I can't fact check it, but this is the family legend. So they get back to the apartment building, and they get a knock at the door, and on the other side of the door is one of their tenants, and he has a big stack of cash, and he gave it to them because it was month's rent for 2-3+ years that they had been away and incarcerated in the camps. He had gone every month to every apartment and collected rent. And then he kept that money and gave it to them, and they were able to rebuild.
You touched on this while you were telling your story, but this was a sort of rare occasion at the time. It wasn't the common norm that you would see happening to most families returning from camps, correct?
Yeah, I think I think my family was extremely lucky. I mean, there are stories. I went up to the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial, which is an awesome place if you haven't been. It's so beautiful, and they have stories that the farmers there had shared about a Japanese American farmer selling his farm for $1 when he had to leave for incarceration, and then buying it back for $1 when he got home. You know, things like that. You hear about things like that, but there was a study that was done in 1983 that was commissioned by the federal government, and it looked at income and property loss of the Japanese American community. So in 1983, it was estimated that the Japanese American community lost somewhere between $680 million and $3.4 billion just in property.
Wow, see, that's a large number just to look at, but thinking about inflation, it's going to be much higher in today's numbers.
When you think about the numbers and the amount of money that was lost, I think it's pretty clear that it was a rarity and that my family was just incredibly lucky.
All right, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Why is it important for us to discuss an event 80 years ago? Because it's still prevalent today. Discrimination is still a recurring problem in our society. It is still legal to intern a specific group of people on the basis of something they cannot control, such as race, gender, and ethnicity. Discrimination is unacceptable, and reminding ourselves of our past actions will not only dispel us from repeating our treacherous history, but prompt us in making changes in our community. In the 1944 Korematsu v. U.S. case, the internment of Japanese Americans was upheld with a 6-3 vote. When asked about this, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said, "Well, of course the Korematsu ruling was wrong, and I think we have repudiated in a later case, but you are kidding yourself if you think the same thing will not happen again." Today, many interest groups still fight for Japanese American rights, two of which are the Densho Project and Suru for Solidarity groups. These are independent groups created in the years after the incarceration of Japanese Americans. The Densho Project focuses more on the history and effect of social injustices that occurred during incarceration, while the Suru for Solidarity group focuses more on advocating against the social injustices still prevalent today, regardless of who those injustices are aimed at.
Incarceration could happen to any race or any ethnicity, not just Japanese Americans.
A lot of history is erased and not taught fully in depth.
I wanted to spread awareness of less commonly known events in World War II.
to spread awareness and make sure nothing like this ever happens again.
As a Filipino American, it's important to share other social injustices as well as our own. As a Japanese American, I wanted to share the social injustice of incarceration and how it can happen again.
The Japanese incarceration proves that inequality, the worst form that it could take, would be unequal justice.
I'm doing this project just to pass this message further on in case this happens to anybody in the future.
Being part Japanese, I wanted to bring to light the injustices that happen to the Japanese here in America.
To receive a different perspective in this matter.
Participate in this project because I want to spread awareness about the discrimination in our community.
Today, this not only concerns Japanese Americans.
Human rights are violated every day.
A violation to one group's rights is a violation to all.
As humans, we must stand for each other and fight for each other. Di, Landy.
Gambare. Good luck!